Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment, letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I grew up in a place where silence was thick, stretching over the endless miles of Arizona desert like a heavy quilt. Our little town was barely more than a scattering of houses, a gas station, and a diner that stayed open late enough for insomniacs and truckers passing through. The locals whispered about strange things in the desert, the kind of stories that make you laugh when the sun is up but feel too close for comfort when the shadows stretch long. I never paid much attention to them, not until that night. It was a little after midnight, and I had just wrapped up a double shift at the diner. My arms ached from carrying trays, and my feet felt like I'd been walking on broken glass. The highway stretched ahead of me, empty and quiet, the asphalt glinting faintly under the moonlight. The air was still, almost too still, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I turned up the radio to drown out the unease, but the static hissed back at me, broken and garbled. It was one of those old stations that barely hung on to a signal in the middle of nowhere. I fiddled with the dial, trying to find some music, but gave up when the static turned into faint whispers, as if voices were caught just beneath the noise. About 10 miles from home, I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker in the rearview mirror, a glint of something reflecting the car's taillights. I squinted, leaning forward slightly, thinking maybe it was a coyote or a stray dog. We got those a lot out here. But then it moved, and my stomach clenched. It wasn't on four legs. The figure was upright, running on two legs, but not like any person I'd ever seen. Its movements were jerky, like a marionette controlled by a drunk puppeteer. Its limbs flailed too much, bending in ways they shouldn't. And it was fast, unnaturally fast. I pressed harder on the gas, the old car groaning in protest, but the figure didn't fall behind. If anything, it was gaining on me. My heart pounded in my chest, loud and insistent, drowning out the engine's growl. Then it screamed. The sound wasn't human. It was high-pitched and broken, like someone had taken a person's voice and twisted it until it snapped. My hands clenched the steering wheel, knuckles white, as I forced myself not to look back. My mind raced with questions I didn't want answered. What the hell was it? What did it want? And, most importantly, how the hell was I going to outrun it? The lights of my house came into view, and I let out a shaky breath. Safety was so close. I turned sharply into the driveway, gravel crunching beneath the tires, and slammed the car into park. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. And then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Soft, deliberate, like someone knocking politely on a door. Only it wasn't a door. It was my rear window. My breath caught, and my chest tightened as I slowly, painfully slowly, turned my head. Its face was pressed against the glass. The skin was pale, stretched thin, and cracking like old parchment. Its eyes glowed faintly, wide and unblinking. And its mouth was the worst. It was too big, stretched into a grin that felt more like a threat, with teeth that looked like shards of broken porcelain. For a moment, I couldn't move. My body was frozen, trapped in the overwhelming, bone deep fear that if I so much as blinked, it would break the glass and drag me out. Then instinct kicked in. I slammed my hand down on the headlights, flooding the driveway with light. And just like that, it was gone. The driveway was empty, the night eerily still again. My hands shook as I fumbled with the door handle, finally managing to open it and stumble into the house. I locked every door, every window, and sat in the middle of the living room with a kitchen knife clutched in my hand until the first rays of sunlight seeped through the curtains. The next morning, I found scratches on the car's rear window, faint but unmistakable. 3 long, deliberate marks, like something with claws had dragged them across the glass. I haven't driven that road alone at night since, and I never will again. Out here in the desert, the legends are more than just stories. Sometimes they're warnings. Story 2. 2 summers ago, my friends and I decided to go camping. It was a spur-of-the-moment plan, the kind of thing you do when the night feels alive and you're stupid enough to think you're invincible. There were 4 of us, me, Aaron, Billy, and Jason. We were college buddies, bonded by years of bad decisions and shared secrets. That night, the idea of sleeping under the stars in the middle of nowhere sounded like the perfect adventure. We ended up near a reservation in New Mexico, private land. We knew we weren't supposed to be there, but the area was secluded, and we were sure no one would notice. It was an unspoken rule among us. Ask for forgiveness, not permission. So, we pitched our tents, cracked open a few beers, and settled around a campfire that Jason had built with surprising skill. The night was beautiful at first. The stars above us were brighter than I had ever seen, scattered like a million pinpricks of light against an inky black sky. The air smelled like pine and smoke, and the fire crackled in a way that felt almost comforting. We laughed, told old stories, and made plans for the future we probably wouldn't keep. It was close to midnight when we heard it, a rustling in the bushes, faint but unmistakable. Billy was the first to notice. He froze mid-sentence, his beer halfway to his lips. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. We all went quiet, straining to listen. The sound came again, a soft shuffling, like something moving through the underbrush. "Probably a raccoon," Aaron said, but his voice was tight. He was always the logical one, the one who tried to keep us grounded, but even he sounded uneasy. The rustling grew louder, more deliberate. These weren't the skittering sounds of a small animal. They were footsteps, slow, heavy, and deliberate. Jason grabbed the flashlight. "Probably just a deer," he muttered, but there was no conviction in his words. He clicked the flashlight on and pointed it toward the trees. At first, we didn't see anything, just the dark silhouettes of trees swaying gently in the breeze. Then the beam of light landed on something that made my stomach drop. It was a deer. At least, that's what it was supposed to be. But something was horribly wrong. Its legs were too long, bending at odd angles, and its antlers twisted and gnarled like blackened roots. It stood there, perfectly still, just beyond the edge of the light. And then it moved. It took a step forward, and its movements were jerky, like a puppet on strings. The worst part was its face. It was almost human, almost. The eyes were too large, too bright, and its mouth, God, its mouth stretched unnaturally wide. as if someone had grabbed the corners and pulled. We stared in stunned silence as it tilted its head, the way a dog does when it hears a strange sound. Then it opened its mouth and spoke. It didn't use words. It mimicked. It mimicked us. Our laughter. The same laughter we'd shared around the fire just minutes before, but distorted. Too loud. Too sharp. Like a recording played on a broken tape. Jason dropped the flashlight, and the beam wavered, casting wild shadows that made the thing look even more grotesque. He screamed, a sound I'd never heard from him before, and that broke the spell. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing my backpack and bolting toward the car. The others followed, their footsteps pounding behind me. I didn't dare look back. I could hear it, though, the laughter growing louder and closer, chasing us through the trees. When we reached the car, Aaron fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them twice. I yanked the door open and practically threw myself inside. The engine roared to life, and we sped off, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel. As we tore down the dirt road, I finally looked back. It was standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the red glow of the taillights. Its head was cocked to the side, its mouth still stretched into that horrible grin. When we got back to civilization, we sat in the car, too shaken to speak. None of us slept that night. The next morning, curiosity got the better of us. We drove back to the campsite, even though every instinct screamed at me to stay far, far away. The place was a mess. The fire had burned itself out, but our tents were torn apart, slashed as if by giant claws. The ground was littered with scratches, long, deep grooves that looked like they'd been made by something with hooves. That was the last time we went camping. We don't talk about it much, and when we do, it's always in hushed tones, like speaking about it too loudly might bring it back. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just an animal. It wasn't human either. It was something else, something that didn't want us there. And now, every time I see a deer on the side of the road, I can't help but look twice, just in case. Story 3. When I was 16, I spent the summer with my grandparents on the Navajo Nation. Their home sat on a quiet patch of land surrounded by miles of open desert and low, scrubby trees. To someone who wasn't used to the reservation, it might have seemed lonely, maybe even eerie. But to me, it was peaceful. The kind of place where the silence wrapped around you like a blanket, and the night sky stretched forever. That summer, I'd gotten into a stupid fight with my parents before coming to stay with my grandparents. I couldn't even remember what the argument was about, but I knew I needed the space. My grandparents didn't ask too many questions. They just let me be, which was what I needed. One night, after dinner, I decided to take a walk. My grandparents warned me to stay close to the house, but I shrugged them off. "I just need some air," I told them. The moon was high, casting a silver glow over the desert. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. I wandered down the dirt road that cut through the property, hands stuffed in my pockets, kicking at loose stones. It felt good to be out there alone. The air was cool, and the stars were brighter than I'd ever seen. I was so lost in my thoughts that it took me a moment to realize I wasn't alone anymore. "Alex," I froze. The voice was faint, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. I turned around, scanning the darkness, but there was no one there. The trees cast long, thin shadows, and the road behind me was empty. Alex, it was louder this time, more distinct, and it came from the direction I just walked. The voice sounded familiar, too familiar. It was my grandmother. I spun around, expecting to see her standing on the road, but again, there was nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Something about the way she'd said my name didn't feel right. It was slower, almost stretched out like she was testing the way it sounded. "Grandma?" I called out, my voice shaking a little. I told myself she'd probably come looking for me, even though she wasn't the type to wander far from the house. Maybe she was worried, but deep down, I knew better. That's when I saw her. She was standing under a tree a little ways off the road, partially hidden in the shadows. For a split second, relief washed over me. There she was. I wasn't imagining it, but something was off. Her arms hung limp at her sides, and she was standing too still, like a statue. She didn't move, didn't say anything. She just stared at me. "Grandma?" I said again, my voice cracking. She smiled then, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't a warm, familiar smile. It was too wide, too sharp. Her teeth glinted in the moonlight, jagged and unnatural. Her eyes glowed faintly, like there was a light behind them. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. "Grandma?" I whispered, but I knew it wasn't her. She tilted her head, the movement jerky, almost mechanical. Then, with a sickening crunch, she dropped on all fours. Her limbs twisted and stretched in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I didn't think. I just ran. The sound of her laughter followed me, high-pitched and distorted, like a broken recording. My legs burned as I sprinted back toward the house, my heart hammering in my chest. Every few seconds, I glanced over my shoulder, but I didn't see her. The laughter, though, didn't stop. When I reached the house, I burst through the door and slammed it shut behind me. My grandmother was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in her hands. She looked up at me, startled. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice soft and calm. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, gasping for air, my back pressed against the door. She got up and came over, placing a hand on my shoulder. It was warm, real. She hadn't left the house all night. The next morning, I told the elders what had happened. They listened quietly, their faces grave. When I finished, one of them nodded. "You encountered a skinwalker," he said. "It tried to lure you away." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I'd heard the stories growing up, but I'd never truly believed them. Not until now. That was the last time I walked alone at night on the reservation. Even now, years later, I still hear that voice sometimes, in my dreams, in the wind, in the quiet moments when I'm alone. And every time it sends a chill down my spine.